The moment I heard a young man in a pressed blue suit chuckle and say, "Well, I guess the boy had to climb pretty far from a garage," something inside my chest folded in on itself like an old pocketknife. It happened during my grandson Daniel's graduation celebration in the spring of 2003, in a hall so bright and polished it felt like the world had been freshly waxed for the occasion. Even now I can still see the rows of folding chairs lined up across the university auditorium earlier that afternoon, their metal legs scraping softly against the floor as families settled in. Programs rustled like quiet birds in people's hands. Proud parents leaned toward one another whispering about majors and internships while cameras flashed like tiny bursts of lightning under the high white ceiling. Daniel had walked across that stage with his shoulders squared and his chin lifted the way his father used to do when he was young. The black gown brushed his legs as he stepped forward, and when the dean placed that rolled diploma in his hand the applause rose up like a warm wave rolling through the hall. I clapped along with everyone else. My hands were old by then. The knuckles thick, the skin creased with years of oil and winter air. They made a duller sound than the others, but I clapped all the same. After the ceremony we moved to the reception hall across campus, a place with tall windows and long white tables covered in linen cloths. There were bouquets of pale flowers arranged in glass vases, and the smell of catered food floated through the air: roasted chicken, buttery rolls, something sweet with cinnamon. People stood in small circles holding drinks that chimed lightly against the rims of crystal glasses. Conversations drifted from table to table like smoke. Some spoke about medical school applications. Others about firms in Chicago or investment opportunities in Denver. It was the sort of room where accomplishments hung in the air like banners you couldn't quite see. I remember standing near the back wall, watching Daniel move from group to group. His mother kept pulling him into photographs. His father shook hands with professors. A few younger cousins chased each other between chairs until someone gently steered them back toward their plates. I felt proud in a way that's hard to describe. Not loud pride. Not the kind that needs a microphone. Just a steady warmth that settles behind your ribs. Daniel had always been the curious one as a child. When he was 6 he used to sit on a wooden stool in the corner of my repair shop, swinging his legs while I worked under the hood of whatever tired car had rolled in that morning. "Why does that belt spin like that?" he'd ask. Or, "What makes the engine sound sad?" Children say things like that. Back then I'd wipe my hands on a rag and try to explain the mystery of pistons and timing chains in a way a boy could understand. He'd listen like I was describing the inside of a clock that ran the whole world. Standing there in that reception hall years later, watching him laugh with classmates dressed in black gowns and bright cords, I thought about those afternoons in the shop when sunlight slipped through the dusty windows and turned floating particles into tiny stars. Life moves quietly until suddenly it doesn't. At some point Daniel guided a few people over to where I stood. "Grandpa," he said, placing a hand on my shoulder, "these are some of the families from my study group." They were polite young folks. Well-dressed. Smiling. One of the girls had bright red heels that clicked against the polished floor when she stepped closer. Daniel introduced me simply. "This is my grandfather, Harold." Hands were shaken. Congratulations were exchanged. Someone asked how far I had traveled for the ceremony. "Just a couple hours downstate," I said. Then came the question that starts so many small turning points in life. "What did you do for work, Harold?" It was asked kindly enough. A curious tone, nothing sharp about it. I told the truth the same way I always had. I ran a small auto repair shop for about 40 years. The young man in the blue suit, tall fellow with neat hair and the confidence of someone who had never worried about rent, tilted his head thoughtfully. "An auto shop," he repeated. Then he laughed lightly, not cruelly, just casually. "Well, I guess Daniel really broke out of that track," he said. "Climbed pretty far beyond the garage." A couple of people chuckled the way people do when they think a comment has landed harmlessly. One woman lifted her glass and said something like, "That's the American dream right there." Another voice added, shows what education can do. None of them meant to wound. That's the thing about moments like that. They rarely arrive wearing sharp edges. They come wrapped in good intentions. Still, I felt the laughter ripple across the space between us like a small wave. My smile stayed in place. Years of customer service teach a man how to hold a steady expression no matter what passes across the counter. Well, I said softly, Daniel worked hard. And that was all. The conversation drifted away from me almost immediately. Someone asked Daniel about a consulting job offer. Another person began talking about real estate markets. Within seconds I was simply the quiet old man again standing near the wall. But inside my chest something had shifted. It wasn't anger. Not exactly. It was more like the strange hollow feeling you get when someone walks through a door you built and compliments the house without noticing the hinges. I looked around the room. Parents with polished shoes and tidy careers stood proudly beside their children. Conversations floated past filled with words like portfolio, residency, firm partnership. The windows along the west wall caught the lowering sun, turning the room gold. Dust drifted in the light above the tables. I folded my hands together. For a moment I wondered if maybe they were right. 40 years in a small brick garage on Maple Street doesn't look like much when stacked against the towers people build their reputations inside. There are no diplomas framed above a hydraulic lift. No plaques for fixing a transmission at midnight so a single mother can drive to work in the morning. No ceremonies when a kid who had nowhere else to go learns how to hold a wrench steady and ends up with a trade that feeds his family. Those things happen quietly. Most of them happen while the rest of the world is asleep. Across the room Daniel laughed at something one of his friends said. The sound carried across the hall and landed softly in my ears. I realized then that none of this embarrassment belonged to him. He had never spoken of my life with anything but respect. The assumptions belonged to the room. Not the boy. Dinner plates were cleared. The smell of coffee replaced the scent of roasted food. Someone dimmed the lights slightly as evening crept toward the windows. At some point Daniel's mother tapped a spoon gently against a glass. The clinking sound rang through the room. Before we all head out, she said, a few people wanted to share a quick memory or toast for Daniel. Applause fluttered politely. A professor spoke first, praising Daniel's discipline. Then a friend told a funny story about late-night study sessions and burnt pizza in the dormitory kitchen. People laughed warmly. I listened. Eventually Daniel's mother glanced toward me. Her eyes were soft. Dad, she said quietly, would you like to say something? For a moment I considered shaking my head. Old men aren't expected to deliver speeches in rooms like that. But I noticed Daniel looking over at me. Not with pressure. Just curiosity. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small folded card I had written earlier that afternoon while sitting alone on a bench outside the auditorium. The paper trembled slightly between my fingers. I stood up slowly. The room quieted in that gentle way crowds do when they sense someone about to speak who doesn't usually take the floor. Crystal glasses settled onto tables. Conversations faded. The evening light slipped lower across the tall windows. And for a moment, before I opened my mouth, I could still hear that young man's voice from earlier echoing faintly in the back of my mind. Climbed pretty far beyond the garage. I cleared my throat softly. Looked at my grandson. And began with a story from a winter night in the shop many years ago. That winter night must have been somewhere around 1987, though the exact year has faded a bit around the edges the way old photographs do. What I remember clearly is the cold. The kind that settles into the bones of a town and stays there. Snow had been falling since late afternoon, thick and quiet, covering Maple Street in a white blanket that softened every sound. The garage lights glowed through the windows like lanterns in a snowstorm. Most folks had already gone home by then. The grocery store down the block shut early. Even the diner closed its doors before 9. But I was still inside the shop. I had the old radio sitting on a shelf near the tool cabinet, humming low through a station that played country songs about lost highways and long roads home. The heater rattled in the corner, doing its best to push warmth into a space built mostly of concrete and steel. Around 10 that night a sedan rolled slowly into the lot, tires crunching over packed snow. I remember wiping my hands on a rag and stepping outside. A young woman sat behind the wheel. Maybe 25. Maybe younger. Hard to say. She looked tired the way people do when life hasn't been giving them much sleep. Steam curled from the car's hood. She stepped out and hugged her coat close. "I'm sorry," she said, almost before I could speak. "I know you're probably closed." I told her it was all right. The engine had overheated. A cracked hose, as it turned out. Nothing fancy. But the problem was the hour and the storm and the fact that she worked a morning shift cleaning offices across town. "If the car doesn't run," she said quietly, "I can't get there. And if I miss tomorrow," she didn't finish the sentence. Some sentences don't need finishing. So I pulled the car inside. The snow kept falling outside while I worked under the hood. My hands were stiff from the cold and the metal tools felt like blocks of ice when I first picked them up. The radio kept playing. The heater rattled. It took about an hour to swap the hose and refill the coolant. When I finally tightened the last clamp and turned the key, the engine settled into that steady rhythm that mechanics learn to recognize the way doctors recognize a healthy heartbeat. She exhaled in relief. When I told her the price, she looked embarrassed. "That's more than I have tonight," she said. I remember thinking about my own daughter around that age. About the times life had leaned hard on her shoulders. So I said something simple. "Bring it by next time you can." She tried to thank me about 5 different ways. I told her the road would freeze if she didn't get moving soon. The car pulled out into the snow and disappeared down Maple Street. I didn't think much more about it after that. Just another night. Just another car. But 3 weeks later she came back. This time the sun was out and the sidewalks were clear. She walked into the shop carrying a small envelope with cash folded carefully inside. Before handing it over, she said something I've never forgotten. "I made it to work every day after that night," she said. "They promoted me last week." Then she smiled in that quiet, relieved way people smile when life finally loosens its grip a little. I finished telling that story and paused. The reception hall was very still. Even the air seemed to wait. I looked around at the tables, the flowers, the glasses catching the dim evening light. "You see," I said gently, "running a shop like mine doesn't put your name on many things." A few people shifted slightly in their chairs. "But every once in a while," I continued, "you realize that keeping one small engine running can keep a whole life moving forward." My voice wasn't loud. Just steady. I fixed a lot of cars over the years. Thousands, probably. Most of them I forgot by the next week. But every now and then someone would come back and tell me a story about where that car carried them. I glanced toward Daniel. Sometimes it was a first job. Sometimes it was a hospital visit. Sometimes it was just a father trying to get home for dinner. A faint smile passed across my face. Engines break. That's what they do. My job was just to help them start again. The room stayed quiet in that thoughtful way that means people are turning something over in their minds. I folded the little card back into my hand. "Daniel didn't climb away from the garage," I said softly. "He climbed from it." The words hung there for a moment. No anger in them. Just truth. I'm proud of the work he's done. Proud of the places he'll go. But I hope he remembers something. I looked at him again. There are a lot of people in this world who don't stand on stages. They're the ones tightening the bolts underneath everything else. Somewhere near the back of the room a chair creaked quietly. "Those lives don't always look impressive," I said. "But they keep the wheels turning." Then I gave the small shrug of a man who has said what he came to say. That's all I wanted to share. For a few seconds no one moved. Then Daniel stood. The applause started with him. It wasn't thunderous. Not the roaring kind you hear in stadiums. But it spread across the room slowly, like warmth moving through a cold house. I nodded once, thanked them, and sat back down. The evening wound down after that. People gathered their coats. Chairs scraped gently against the floor. The caterers began clearing plates while the last of the sunset faded beyond the tall windows. A few guests stopped by to shake my hand. The young man in the blue suit came over too. He looked a little embarrassed. "Sir," he said, "I didn't mean." I waved it off with a small smile. "Son," I told him, "most people don't." He nodded slowly, understanding something he probably hadn't understood an hour earlier. Later, when most of the crowd had drifted away, Daniel walked with me out to the parking lot. The air had cooled and the sky was turning deep blue above the campus buildings. We stood beside my old pickup truck. For a while neither of us said anything. Then he spoke. "Grandpa," he said quietly, "I used to love sitting in that shop with you." I chuckled. "You mostly asked questions." "Yeah," he said. "You always answered them." He looked down for a moment, then back up. "I never thought the shop was small." I reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "Good," I said. "Because the truth is, life has a funny way of measuring things. The world counts titles. It counts offices. It counts the number of floors in the buildings where people work. But it rarely counts the hands that built the staircases." Years passed after that night. Daniel went on to build a career that filled more rooms like that reception hall. Sometimes he'd call me just to ask how an engine noise sounded over the phone. Old habits. My shop closed eventually. The building on Maple Street became a bakery, believe it or not. Smells a lot better these days. But every once in a while someone recognizes me in town. "Didn't you used to run that garage?" they'll ask. And I say yes. Just that. No speeches. No explanations. Because the truth settled into my bones long ago. A good life doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes with grease under your fingernails and a heater rattling in the corner of a quiet shop while snow falls outside. And if you're lucky, somewhere down the road, a young man you once taught to ask questions will stand tall on a stage built partly by your hands. That's enough. It always was.